Okay, so in this video I'm going to show you how to add a grid to your reference photo and use that grid to transfer an enlargement of the contour lines onto your final drawing using the grid that you'll put on there as well. So you'll notice right off the bat that this is a childhood photo of me, but the printout is not that great. The quality kind of is streaky and there's some problems with the toner. And so just know that that's okay. This is enough information that I need for this purpose. All I need really to see is the contour lines that are there, enough to see the edges of the shape that I can draw on there. I'll be using my reference photo that's on the computer that I have of this to actually finish the drawing. And so this part, it doesn't have to be a really good quality printout. It just needs to be enough of the contour lines. So however, one thing to know is that you might want to play with the contrast and the brightness of the photo. If you can't see, like for example, I could maybe adjust the photo to get more definition in the shadow here because it's really hard to see the edge there. You might also notice that depending on the skin tones, or like say the area up here where the top of the head and the background meet, it would be easier to see that if I adjusted, say, maybe add the make it brighter, or I could lower the contrast. Sometimes that helps, because really when I change the contrast there, I'm changing the overall contrast of the photo, and so it makes it easier to see that smaller difference if I'm changing the overall contrast to be lower. So sometimes lowering the contrast can make it easier to see the definition in areas, so you might have to adjust that when you print. So for drawing the grid on my reference photo, I can use any number of tools as long as I can see the grid lines. It's not quite as important for this. When I draw the grid on my final piece of paper, I'm going to use a 6H pencil, and I'm going to draw very lightly because I may want to erase that grid later. But for this photo, I don't care if it's gonna be erased or not, and actually I might need to draw a darker line with a Sharpie in order to see that line in comparison to some of the darker areas in my photo. Actually, I'm gonna use this 6H one because it's even sharper. And you should have already printed it out in 6x8, so you'll notice that if you check the measurements, it should be 6 inches in one direction and 8 inches in the other direction. So we're going to draw a 1-inch square grid on here, and you'll notice whenever you have a ruler that the measurements don't always start right at the edge of the ruler. They actually start a little ways in because sometimes the ends of the rulers get marred or damaged, and so they want you to be able to still measure completely. So start from the 0 mark, not from the edge of the ruler, whenever you're measuring. That's a good rule of thumb. I'm going to start from one end, and you may not need to mark the edge because it's already kind of a line, but if the edge of your photo, say on one side or the other, has a lot of white, you may need to actually draw that line in too, and so you may want to mark that. You don't have to. And then go on down the line and carefully mark right on each inch line. And I'm not drawing super dark lines at this point yet, just in case I need to make a mistake and redraw those lines. I'm going to use the same side when I measure the top. So I'm measuring from the same on the left side that I did on the bottom, left side, and mark every inch along there, carefully matching it up with that line for each inch. And now I can just go ahead and connect those lines. And how that looks, if you'll notice, when I'm drawing with a ruler, that I don't actually make it all the way to the edge of that ruler. So often there's a little bit of a space between where the pencil hits the paper and where the ruler edge hits the paper. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space there, but I'm going to make sure that I can see both of those marks and then just connect them. And I can make that line pretty dark so that I can actually see it over the dark background of that photo. And you can see it's kind of shiny, so it's easy to see. That's one benefit or downside of graphite, depending on how you look at it. Now I'm going to do the same thing, but go in the other direction on my photo. So, and this time I'm going to have more lines because it's longer. But again, I'm still measuring from the same side. So that my marks match up. And that's really because sometimes the print maybe is too long, a little bit in one direction or the other, or the edge of the paper isn't the square exactly. So it's good to measure from the same edge. And then just match those up again, same thing. So I have a 1-inch grid drawn here. I can label them if I want to. I can number one side, maybe letters on the other, if that helps you identify the squares later. It's totally an optional step, but you do want to make sure you put your name on this, just because it may not be a photo of you or may not be recognizable as you, and your period number. And I'm going to do the same thing for this other photo that I'll probably use for an anamorphic drawing. Just know that when I'm using this one for the drawing that I'm putting on here, that's 2 times as big. So everything that's on here is 1-inch squares. These squares will be 2-inch. And that means everything that I put in these squares will be 2 times as big here as they are here. Again, if I need to make that grid darker, I can use a Sharpie, but I can see the lines just by the reflection and the indentation on the paper made by the pencil. So that's good enough for that. Now all I need to do is just draw a 2-inch grid on my piece of paper here. And I might need a larger yardstick to do that. But again, you'll notice that the measurements on the yardstick don't start at the very end of the stick. They actually start just a little bit in. So the 0 line is right there, and that's where I'll start my measurements. And again, this time it's a 2-inch grid, so instead of marking every inch, I'm going to mark every 2 inches. Lined up so I can see. So every 2 inches, mark it carefully. And marking very lightly as well. Remembering that I may want to erase these grid lines later. I'm going to measure from the same side of the paper, so measure from the left side here, measuring from the left side over here, and I can just match it up. Actually, we'll set my often I'll set my ruler right along that edge on the bottom, so that I know that it's square with the paper. And then again, making sure that I'm not the edge of the ruler, but actually where the 0 mark is. And then start making my marks across there. Again, making sure that I'm using a 6H pencil and doing so very lightly. Once I have those lines, it's just like the smaller grid, and make sure I leave some space. And even with these rulers, it sometimes can be even harder to get all the way up against that ruler, so leaving a little more space might even be a good idea. You notice that my line perfectly intersected those lines because I left a little space. Again, these are really light drawn lines. I'm drawing them a little bit darker so that you'll actually be able to see them in the video. But you should draw them as lightly as you possibly can, just so you can barely see them. Kind of more like that one. If I'm making them light enough, you probably won't see them in the video. You can see, you can barely see these lines here. You can see these a little better. These are probably what your lines need to look like. Super light. Same thing, but from the other direction. Again, starting from the 0 point there, and a 2-inch grid. Alright, so I have a 2-inch grid here. Notice that I should have 8 squares going this way and 6 going this way to match the grid that I have on here, which is 6 by 8. And now I am ready to begin drawing the contour lines, which I will do with the 6H pencil again, because I may want to erase these lines later. These lines will probably not define what I'm doing, and I may make mistakes in the process of drawing these contour lines, so I want them to be easily erased, because this may be a process of some trial and error. Remember that everything that you draw here on your final drawing is going to be 2 times as big as it is here, because here these squares are 2 inches wide and here they are 1 inch. So for example, if I wanted to start by drawing the edge of this shirt in the bottom right corner here, I could just eyeball it and see how far in is it. Well, it kind of looks like about there. But if I'm not quite sure if that's the right distance in, I can measure and check. So I'm going to actually recommend that you use millimeters and centimeters rather than inches or the standard American measurements, and that is because multiplication with metric is much easier, and so it'll be easier for you to figure out how long something should be in millimeters or centimeters rather than trying to multiply fractions on the standard measurements, which is much more difficult for people. Although it is a good practice to try and practice multiplying fractions, I don't recommend it just for this project. It'll make it easier if you're trying to do quick doubling of measurements. Use metric. So for example, I can measure how far it is. It looks like it's about 3 centimeters or 3 millimeters from the edge of the page to that shirt on my reference. So on my drawing, it should be 6 millimeters. So I probably actually made that a little bit too wide. And you may notice that you'll either have a tendency to make your initial judgments are too small or too large. That's okay, you'll get used to that. And so now I may try to draw that other line at the top. That's kind of my other major contour line that I have in this square at this point. Let's see if I can get that one in there and put it in the right place. So on here it is, that one's about 4 millimeters, so it should be about 8 millimeters here. And I did a pretty good job getting it that time to the right proportion. So you'll notice that with practice, you'll have to use the ruler less, and you can just eyeball it a lot more. So one way to do this is to go square by square. I could go through here and maybe even add some of the major contour lines that are in this shirt, or I could continue this contour line through to where it ends and then do that same process for all the different contour lines. So you can decide to go square by square or follow contour lines. I kind of like to follow the contour lines just to let them get more complete, and then I can kind of use them as references later if I'm trying to add some other things. So I find it useful to go that route, although for some people it can be really helpful to just look at it individually square by square so that you're not focused on what you're seeing. If you're going to do that, I would recommend even just go ahead and cover up the squares you're not looking at, so you can really focus on that. So I may go through here and actually kind of follow these lines through. Again, you're using 6H for this so that you can erase these lines later, although you may end up using some of these lines in your final drawing. But you don't want to go into too much detail yet. It's because at some point I'm going to want to actually erase my grid. You may decide that you want to keep the grid on your final drawing or that you want to erase it. Some reasons that people might want to keep it is, like, say if your design is you want to go like a checkered pattern, like every other square is a different material, like say colored pencil is in every other square and then your other squares are only graphite. That might be something that you choose to do with your grid, and in that case it might be okay to keep your grid. However, if you want to have a seamless drawing at the end that looks like you didn't use a grid, then you should draw your major contour lines in first, leave the details and the shading for after you come back in, and erase the grid. And once you've erased too much on a page or a certain part of a paper, sometimes the surface is very different. So it's best to really only do the contour lines and then erase the grid. You also don't want to spend too much time using the measurement strategy to transfer your original reference onto your final drawing. It can be really helpful for your initial contour lines, but you're not going to want to spend too much time on that. It's also important to know that once you have contour lines on here, it's probably not going to look correct yet. It's probably not even going to look correct until you start adding some shading and a full range of values. So just trust your grid and your reference, and go with what you have, get the best contour lines you can, and then erase the grid and start actually just trusting that you have the right information. So one important clarification about the fact that the measurements are 2 times as big on the final drawing as they are on the reference. But you might notice, if you look at it to yourself, then why does it look like it's 4 times as big, right? Because if I took this image and repeated it in one of those. It's only a quarter of this page. Well, that's because we're working in 2 dimensions. So we're actually multiplying. We're making it twice as big in width and in height. And so in total, we end up with an image that appears in total 4 times as big. But even when we're measuring and we're transferring measurements, they're still going to be only twice as big in any direction, because we're only working in 1 dimension when we're measuring on a line like this. So at this point I have enough contour information. I haven't put a lot of details in yet, but it's at this point where I need to get rid of the grid lines if I want to, because they're becoming too complicated with all the other. If you happen to be planning to do an anamorphic drawing using one of the half cylinders in this sort of format, it might be helpful to draw your image first on a normal grid, just with the contours like this, so that you have a reference for some of the important contours, and then go ahead and transfer it on here. When I'm transferring it here, notice that I have an 8x8 grid, and this is 6x8. So if I want to center this in there, I'm going to put the bottom corner here in this square, and then I can just have extra background that I can add decoration into on both sides. So basically I'll draw this square there, it'll be a little bit stretched. When I do the anamorphic drawing, I like to start at the bottom here and do that one. It's probably the easiest first because it's the least stretched out. As you go up, you're going to be doing the next row, and it'll be a little bit more stretched out, and then it'll get even more stretched out as you go up the rows until it's really distorted. So by the time I get up to the face up here in this row, it's going to be really wide and much wider than it is in the original. So it'll be fun to see how both of these drawings look side by side when they're finished. I think I'm going to draw this image into an anamorphic grid as well. One important thing I should mention about using the anamorphic grid is that whatever image you put onto here is going to actually end up being a reflection when you have your cylinder mirror that you're going to place in place. So when a viewer looks at your work and sees it on the mirror here, it's going to be a reflection of this. And so if you do want your final drawing or the image that people will see in the reflection to be like the regular image, then you'll have to do a mirror image of that when you print it, and I can show you how to do that on Word. And you could use a 1-inch grid reference, but it really would help you if you're doing the anamorphic drawing to make a reference grid of your contour lines first, so that you have some idea of what you're going to put in those boxes, because it will be really distorted and unusual here, and this step will make it much easier for you to get the big contours in here.